Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
Survival was the rule of the day.
My jaw was broken. I could feel my molars in the centre of my
We weren't out there
mouth.
to take country. We were out there
At the end of the day, everyone
That was our job.
wearing green is a soldier.
We've lost communication.
Getting yourself blown up does some interesting things to you.
A place like the Middle East is constantly
There's
changing.
quite enough pressure
What
when
we
you
do there is
deploy and
constantly
everything
changing.
We killed Dave.
And this, the thing was our own minefield. He held me up with a broken whiskey bottle and machete.
Battle for Australia.
Welcome to the first of a two-part episode on Andrew Robertson. Andrew served in the Royal Australian Navy in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and a number of other postings before he retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1982. He spoke with Angus Hordern about his remarkable career in the Navy. Enjoy.
So welcome to Life on the Line. I'm Angus Hordern, and today I'm joined by Andrew Robertson. Andrew, thank you for speaking with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Angus.
Could you share your story with us, please?
Yes, well, perhaps if I start off with a bit of a background. As everybody knows, 3/4 of the world's surface is covered by sea. If you look at history itself, all the great empires of the world were formed by sea power. You can start right back in the early days of Greece and Carthage and Rome, and you can go through the empires of Portugal, Spain, France, Holland, Britain, the United States of America, and all of that was done with sea power. What an awful lot of people don't fully realise is from the Allied point of view in World War I and World War II, they were maritime wars, because what they did was to gather the resources of the British Empire from every corner of the globe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, the British colonies all over the world, and bring them those resources to where they were required. In World War I, of course, it was very largely in Europe. And then, of course, the great might of the United States of America in 1917 in World War I, it was to bring the resources of the United States to where they were required. This all required sea power. And initially, of course, in both wars, sea lanes had to be cleared of enemy raiders, they had to be cleared of minefields, they had eventually, of course, to be cleared, if possible, of submarines, aircraft, and everything else that interfered with the bringing of those resources to where they were required. Then, of course, the great armies could be launched, and the air forces, because while air forces are highly mobile, they cannot be dispatched overseas without all the wherewithal to get their fuel and their bombs and their food and their stores and everything else to be able to operate from distant airfields and the defence of those airfields themselves. So as far as the West is concerned, by and large, the great requirement is maritime power to be able to control the environment around you. In the case of Australia, the approaches to Australia in particular, and to enable the resources that we may be able to produce to be dispatched overseas.
Let's go back right to the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Britain and came to Australia at the tender age of 2 in 3-cornered pants.
And what was it like growing up during the Great Depression?
The Great Depression was terrible. I don't think nowadays people have any idea of the poverty and the terrible strain people went through. My father was a soldier settler, and we were well inland in Western Australia, about 250 miles inland from Perth, and the poor men who'd tried to get a job would come in their swags and call it our little shack, I suppose you'd call it, where we were trying to make a farm out of nothing, and do anything at all for a feed, chop wood or pluck chickens or do anything else. Indeed, some of them were so emaciated, one My mother kept a tent at the back of the house, and in it was a stretcher, and one morning the poor fellow who'd arrived was dead in his bed. And people forget the terrible privation of the Great Depression, and they look upon Australia now, a land of milk and honey. The definition of poverty is nothing like the definition of poverty of 80 years ago.
So before we got to the Great Depression, we had the Great War. What was your family's association and history there?
Well, my father in the Great War was in a Scots battalion. He was in the original landing at Mons in 1914, and he was wounded 3 times, finally in the Battle of the Somme, and each time they patched him up and sent him back in. He then went into the Indian Army, and then after that he resigned and brought the family to Australia.
And do you have any other military history in the family? I understand there's a great-grandfather who was an admiral in the British fleet.
Yes, my great-grandfather was, indeed. He was towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in things like the attack on San Sebastian, and of course after that against the Barbary pirates on the north coast of Algeria, and matters of that ilk. And my father, of course, was Army, and in World War II, my brother had left Australia just before the war to join the Royal Air Force, and he was in the Royal Air Force where unfortunately he was killed. And I was in our Navy, and I had a sister who was a nurse in the hospital, not a nurse, a VAD in the hospitals in the Middle East with the 9th Division.
So if your dad was in the Army, what was it that made you join the Navy?
Well, Western Australia was much more exposed than the rest of Australia, and it was a very tiny population, and the Navy was very much more understood and believed in Western Australia because the whole place depended entirely on the oceans. When I was a little boy, of course, there was a railway across, which ran a couple of times a week. There was no road across the continent, and any connection with the east of Australia was by sea, because, of course, airways were not in operation in those days. And the great connections were, in fact, to Britain via the Indian Ocean, either Suez or Cape Town, and to Singapore and to India. And yes, there was connection with the east of Australia, but the big main routes were, in fact, those areas.
So, Andrew, can we talk about your naval training? Where did you enlist? When did that happen?
I sat the exams in 1938 and was selected from Western Australia at the end of that year and joined the Naval College in Flinders Naval Depot in the south of Victoria in beginning of February 1939, about, 9 months before World War II broke out, when naval officers were still wearing cocked hats and frock coats.
And can you tell about your early days at the depot? What sort of training did you get up to?
Well, the training at Flinders, we were there for, in my case, about 3.5 years. Normally it was 4, but we were sent to sea early. And it was a very thorough training, a very physical training. We did a great deal of gymnastics. We had to run everywhere and, of course, play a great number of games compulsorily. There was no voluntary aspects to it. Our schooling took us up to what would now be called the higher school certificate, and the discipline was extremely strong, quite unreasonable in many ways, quite brutal in some ways, but we survived.
What was your first action posting?
When things were getting extremely serious after Japan entered the war, and we all knew, of course, then that the situation in the Pacific was dire, because in December 1941, the American battle fleet had been destroyed in Pearl Harbor, and the British battle fleet in based in Singapore, which they'd rushed out, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse had been sunk, and indeed after that the various British ships were sunk along with our own, the Perth and so on, in the battles in the Dutch East Indies. It was a very interesting thing really, because the Chief of the Naval Staff, soon a week or so after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, came and addressed all the officers at Flinders Naval Depot and said, "I'm going to tell you the truth of the situation because you're going to be hurled into this and you ought to know what's going on." And he told us that the loss of the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse and the destruction of the American battle fleet, which he outlined as what had been sunk, so we all knew, meant that there was nothing whatever could save the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies or Singapore or Malaysia. And indeed, we faced the Japanese being able to come wherever they liked to, right down to New Guinea and the areas throughout the Dutch East Indies, which is, of course, now Indonesia. He was absolutely correct in everything that he forecast, because there was no naval power any longer could stand up. There was no way that Singapore could be supported, and that the army there was doomed. And that was well known in naval circles from the loss of the Prince of Wales and Repulse.
So your first ship was at the Australia?
My first ship was HMS Australia. We were posted out from Flinders Naval Depot, and we came to Sydney here, and half of my term were going to the Canberra and half to the Australia, and we were waiting in Sydney to be told where we could go to join them, when, of course, the Canberra was sunk in the Battle of Savo Island in the Solomons. And so half my term were then dispatched by merchant ship to join the Royal Navy ships, wherever they may be in the Indian Ocean or in the Atlantic. The rest of us were very upset because we would be sent into the Pacific, which would be very dull in comparison, because the further you went, the more palm trees you captured and the nice beaches you saw, but you got away from the bright lights and any possibility of going to dances or enjoying the high life. So we were very envious of these fellows going off to Europe.
So your action was really up in New Guinea and the Solomons and the New Hebrides. Can you speak of those particular times?
Yes, well, we were based, of course, in the Coral Sea in Task Force 44. The commander of the task force was in the flagship, the HMS Australia, and we had the HMS Hobart, which are the only two of the modern cruisers out of the five still afloat. And we had American destroyers usually, and we had, of course, supply ships and so on. And we all knew, of course, that while we held the Coral Sea, all would be well. The battle for the Coral Sea was being decided largely in the Solomons, with the enormous battles between the American and the Japanese fleets. But we held the Coral Sea against any threat of the very, very powerful Japanese fleet coming through the straits on the northern side of the Coral Sea and being able to attack again as they did in the Battle of the Coral Sea. I never saw a newspaper correspondent or a war correspondent or anybody else, and I doubt if there were any in any of the other ships in the various things in which we took part. So very little is shown in historical films or anything of that order of what was going on in the Solomons or after that in the gradual push north. But the Battle of the Coral Sea was absolutely vital to Australia. It really was the battle for Australia, that and the battles in the Solomons. The reason I say that is there could have been no New Guinea campaign, no Kokoda track, no drive forward in New Guinea, at all if the Coral Sea had been a strategic defeat. If the second American carrier, for instance, the Yorktown, had been sunk, and then the whole of the east coast of Australia had been wide open to a massive attack by the Japanese fleet wherever they liked. And you would have perhaps had battleships, cruisers and destroyers as well as carriers, and there would have been great devastation, if not landings, in Australia, because if the Yorktown had sunk, the Americans only had 2 carriers for the Battle of the Midway, which was a crucial battle of the war, against perhaps 6 Japanese carriers, and the other battle would not have taken place, or the chances of victory would have been very small.
Andrew, at the time, can you explain what you were actually doing on board and what your duties were?
As midshipmen, well, we went to sea as cadet midshipmen, and the greatest promotion of our lives was 4 months later when we put the proud white patches on our collars and we were now midshipmen. We'd had 4 months of training at sea. Our training every day and every week we were given a part of the ship that we had to study very, very closely, where it was the magazines, the engine rooms, the boiler rooms, the turrets, in the communications arrangements, in the damage control of the ship, in the aircraft and how it operated, how it was recovered, and every possible aspect of the ship. We had to write reports on it, sketches and everything else, and we had to learn how to control the torpedoes, how to control the guns, how to control everything. And we of course, did time down the boiler rooms and the engine rooms on the sprayers in the boiler rooms, flashing up the boilers and everything else, under, of course, the guidance of the people who really knew what was going on, the leading seamen, the leading stokers, the petty officers and the chief petty officers, and, of course, the officers. But the real knowledge was, of course, so much in the hands of the people who actually operated the machines.
What was your action station on board the Aussie?
I had a number of action stations. We were sometimes on the bridge, sometimes in the gunnery control positions. And mine usually was in what was called the transmitting station. That is these days called the computer room, where the giant computer, which had about 15 men around it, was mechanical, electrical, and you wound in the speed of the ship, the course of the ship that came in automatically, the direction of the enemy, the direction the enemy was going, the temperature of the atmosphere, the temperature of the magazines, the muzzle velocity of the guns and everything else. And out of these mechanical electrical computers came the directions to the guns, where to point it, what elevation to be at. And we were locked in down below in under 4 inches of armour, way down in the ship. I think our chances of ever getting out were probably quite low. The worst time I had there was we were in there for 24 hours at action stations on supporting one of the operations. And, of course, there was no air conditioning. The seawater temperature was 87 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature down there was very high, and we stripped off just a pair of pants, all of us. There were about 25 of us in there all told, with the people who were communicated to the guns and the bridge and everywhere else. And when they opened the hatches, there was about, I suppose you'd say, 5 millimeters of sweat over the entire deck.
I'm sure there are many, but are there any particular actions that you remember of an enemy engagement? I
suppose while I was there, we had a lot of alarms. There was one particular one. We were in Milne Bay getting ready for the push north, and the Japanese had extremely good flying boats which flew very high at about 30,000 feet. and unless our fighters were up there was no possibility of intercepting them. And they, through very long distance reconnaissances, one came over Milne Bay just as we had, of course, hundreds of ships getting ready for the next operation to take photographs and report what was going on. And we all, of course, slipped our anchors and were at action stations, and all the warships got underway at high speed. And there was no air attack followed, but the flying boat, of course, got away to go back to Rabaul and report what was going on. And then we had a report that there was a Spitfire squadron based at Goodenough Island, and a Royal Australian Air Force. And there was one Spitfire happened to be up at that altitude test flying the aircraft. And he heard what was going on, and he looked around, and there was the flying boat, and he shot it down before it could get the messages back to Rabaul. Many years later, I was in the Western District of Victoria at a dinner party, and I was recounting this tale to an RAAF fellow who said he'd been based at Goodenough Island. He said he was the pilot. But the only other time when we were really doing a lot was the very big landing, which was one of the biggest landings of the war at that stage, on a place called Cape Gloucester on the Dampier-Vitiaz Strait in New Britain. This cape had to be taken, where there were about 5 Japanese airfields, in order for the fleet to be able to go forth for the drive north to take the Admiralty Islands and then the Philippines and so on. And we had a very big task force where our two Australian cruisers, destroyers and so on, and many American destroyers, lots of big landing ships and an enormous number of aircraft which came over with bombing raids and so on, and we all bombarded and landed the 1st Marine Division, which was a really crack United States Marine Division. They were the people who'd done the great battles at Guadalcanal Island. Then they'd had a lovely holiday in Melbourne a year or so later, where the girls looked after them. And then we'd taken them back up to this performance.
You were in the Pacific for the rest of the war?
No, I'd left. I was transferred to the destroyer, the Warramunga, for a few months. That was a great experience to do destroyer time. Unfortunately, the ships were so full of people in those days. For instance, the Australia had 1,250 men when I was on board her. That's an awful lot of people. As midshipmen, we had quite good living conditions on that very big ship, because we had hammocks and somewhere to meet in the gunroom and so on, and we were very well looked after. In the Warramunga, she was a brand new destroyer, but there were so many people, there was nowhere for we midshipmen to sleep. They only had 2 hammocks for 3 of us. So we had hot beds and there was nowhere to sling them, so we slept on top of an oil fuel tank. And unfortunately, the stoker's job, whose job it was to come once every 4 hours and dip to see how much oil was in the tank, used to tread on us in the dark in oily boots, and it was a very unpleasant experience.
And can you explain for those that don't know, what is a hotbed?
A hotbed is one where you get out and someone else gets in. So the bed is still warm. You rush up on the bridge and he rushes helpfully back to go to sleep if he can bear the stench of the oil fuel and people flipping it on him.
So where was Warramunga posted at that time?
Well, we were on escort duties, taking convoys up and down to the various places. We were present for the standoff, for the landing on Woodlark Island, which is one of the between, I suppose, the northern tip of the eastern tip of New Guinea and Rabaul, about perhaps a quarter of the way or so. It was the most advanced place we'd been at that stage, and we landed the Marines there, came back with replacement of landing ships full of equipment for them. And we, to our astonishment, we had air support from the airfield they'd already built. The American CBs, they were called, construction battalions, CB. So they called them CBs, which I always thought was a marvellous title. They were just brilliant. They used to work day and night. And we were there, did that, and we took convoys all over the place. And then we were with the Australia and the Hobart when the great Battle of Coolah Gulf took place and the Battle of Columbangra in the Solomons. The Americans had very heavy losses. 2 cruisers had their bows blown off. One had been sunk. A couple of the destroyers were bashed up. The New Zealand cruiser Leander had been torpedoed. And we were rushed over from the Coral Sea to take their place because surface forces were greatly depleted. We arrived at the great naval base in Sagun Channel in the New Hebrides, which was a remarkable thing because as we entered harbour, we entered with the remnants of this bashed up cruiser squadron with the two cruisers with out their bows and the destroyers in a mess. And when we got in, we couldn't believe the number of damaged ships that were in there being repaired. They had floating docks and lots of I think it was 3 airfields. Tremendous noise of new aircraft we'd never seen before. Huge naval base. And then we sailed the next day, I think, having fueled. And we were relieved, and soon after we were relieved by American destroyers, the Hobart was torpedoed. So that meant that the ship, the Australia, which I then joined a little after that again, was the last operational cruiser in the Royal Australian Navy. At least the last of the modern ones. There was also the Adelaide, but she was a World War I design.
So, Andrew, you're continuing with your Pacific operations, but then you're posted abroad.
Yes, we all were sent. We did our exams for sub-lieutenant. Then we were all sent to Britain by merchant ship to do courses, which you did all over Britain in navigation, in torpedo work, in anti-submarine work. We all did a flying course for about a week of intensive flying, and we did submarine course, all sorts of courses. Then we were posted from there. Britain was a very exciting place to be. We were there for bombing of London and so on. Not the Blitz, but later on desultory bombing most nights. And then we were there for the very intensive V1 flying bomb attacks, and they were quite exciting because when one of those hit, it devastated almost an entire block. And we had then the V2s, the big rockets. So our time there was very exciting. Then we had D-Day, and we were in the reserve of officers for D-Day. I had a brother in the Royal Air Force who was stationed near where I was doing a course. So I flew with him a bit over the channel and looking at all the mustering of the ships and all that sort of stuff. We used to have to deliver the sailing orders, and we did anti-parachute battalion. We had parachutists dropped on the landing zones. We did duties with them and all that sort of thing. And in the meantime, at night we did air raid duties, and in the daytime we tried to learn what we were supposed to be learning about gunnery.
So, Andrew, what was your actual posting? Were you up at Greenwich, or where were you posted?
We did our course. Greenwich was where most of the excitement took place. We also were at a place called near Brighton, at a girls' school called Rodine College, one of the famous British girls' schools which had been overtaken by the Navy. We also did our flying course in Scotland, and most of our courses were in Portsmouth area, which was, of course, under attack a lot because it was one of the main centres for the invasion of France.
You mentioned that you were doing some flying training. Why, if you're a naval officer, are you doing flying?
All the college entrance through the Naval College did flying courses, and from that you either volunteered to become an aviator or you didn't, but you all had to have an understanding of the air and what was involved. So we did flying courses starting off in Tiger Moss, and then we were in Barracuda dive bombers, which had a terrible reputation as the wings came off. So we were glad when we got out of that aeroplane. And we also flew in torpedo bombing. We did torpedo runs and so on in Swordfish. We, of course, weren't the pilots. We were in there learning how it all worked in the place of the observer, because most of them were two. The crew was usually two, and so you were the number two in the crew.
So your training in England comes to an end. What's your next posting?
Well, then I was given instructions just simply to go to catch a certain train, to go to Gourock in Scotland, and not knowing where I was going. Eventually we got to Naples, and I was posted to HMS Kimberley. She wasn't there, so they eventually sent me to Taranto. She wasn't there, and wasn't going to be there. And then we took another transport to Port Said, and then I was quartered in Alexandria. Great splendour in the Union Club there to start with, waiting for this destroyer. And the Navy thought that I was doing too well in a lovely club, and so they put me in a lighthouse. And I had to sleep up near the light, or more or less curled up round the damn thing. And that brought me down to earth. And then she arrived, and I was in the Kimberley for the latter months of World War, of 1944, and then all of 45 till the surrender in May.
And what was Kimberley?
She was a K-class destroyer, one of only two left. All the rest of the squadron, I think there were 8 in the squadron, had been sunk, including Lord Mountbatten's HMS Kelly. And Churchill, with his great sense of history, went to the north of France invasion in one of the two survivors, HMS Kelvin, and he went to the south of France invasion in HMS Kimberley. But I wasn't, unfortunately, on board for that. I joined afterwards.
Andrew, could we digress for a moment and go back to the Germans and the U-boats? From a naval perspective, in your observation during the war, how close do you think it came to the U-boats really being a real problem?
Well, they were a huge problem. They combined with the German surface raiders, not just the Bismarck and the 3 pocket battleships, but also the heavy cruisers and so on, which used to come out of Norway into the Denmark Straits and then down into the convoys if they could get there. But the U-boats were the real enormous threat. And the Germans, of course, put enormous effort into building up the numbers with their marvellous construction machine and their great submarine pens they built in all their U-boat bases, where the U-boats could go inside these great concrete bunkers, which, as far as I know, were never penetrated, even though the Air Force used very big bombs to try and do so. I might be wrong there, but I think that's, I looked at one after the war and it had a few dents in it, that's all. But anyway, I think it was about 2,700 or of that order merchant ships were sunk during World War II, most of them by U-boats, some by aircraft, some by mines, and some by surface raiders, the merchant ships disguised as, with naval crews disguised as merchant ships. The big problem was the U-boats. And, of course, if they had won the Battle of the Atlantic, and I think Mr. Churchill said that the one battle that really concerned him was the Battle of the Atlantic. If that was lost, then Britain would have had to surrender, and with it the British Empire, and come to some agreement with the Germans. And, of course, the might of America could not have been brought into Europe to virtually finish the war. And so the U-boat peril was tremendous. They even had a squadron of them of U-boats based in Palembang and Jakarta. And one of them went to New Zealand, the U-82, spotted an odd ship off our coast.
So the war is coming to an end and you're sent back home.
Yes, well, we did a lot of operations then in the Aegean, and the last surrender of the war was in the Aegean. Of course, the Germans held it very strongly right to the end. The islands of Rhodes, Kos and Leros, and a lot of others, and there were a tremendous number of minefields, and we operated against the Germans there. And then in the liberation of Greece, as the Germans retreated north, and we took over one of the various ports in Greece. And I thought I was captured one day with another officer, but we were let go, all was well.
And did you actually go ashore to accept any surrenders from the Germans or to disarm them?
I was in charge of a boarding party, and we had to intercept Greek kikes, which the Germans were using to run arms into Greece and to connect with their forces in the Dodecanese. That was probably the most exciting part of my time there. We did odd bombardments and things, but it was very exciting to board a kike and open the hatches and hope you didn't get shot by your own boarding party or the fellows who were underneath.
So on VE Day, where were you and what can you remember?
We took the last surrender of World War II in the European theatre, and that was of a Major General Wagner, who was in charge of all the German forces in the Aegean and Crete. That was a very interesting time. Well, the head of Greece came in the old battleship Avarov, which was a World War I battleship, coal burning, and we could see the smoke an hour or so before she arrived.
And what was interesting about the surrender?
Well, the surrender took place from a captured British gunboat, which had been captured by a German platoon. Many years later, when I was in London, I actually met the head of the German Armed Forces, who was in fact the captain of that particular gunboat. And I had the only photograph taken of the surrender at that stage. So he was delighted to hear this, and I sent him the photograph after I got back to Australia of him in his one and only naval command. He became the Inspector General of the whole German Armed Forces, and he was in charge of the gunboat, a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht.
Did you have any opportunity once the European campaign had wound down to be posted back to the Pacific?
Yes, when it finished, I was then a navigator for the last bit of the Kimberley, and I'd been the anti-submarine officer before that, which was quite interesting. We took the Kimberley back to Britain to pay off alongside her sister ship in Dartmouth, and then almost immediately I was posted to return to the Pacific for the rest of the war. We came in a transport ship, unescorted, because of course the European end was quite safe. That was a miserable trip with 4,600 unhappy sailors, of whom had been sunk several times and had miserable wars, being sent out from Britain to fight in the Pacific against the Japanese, when all their friends were being demobbed and getting good jobs. So they were very, very unhappy men, and they were stuffed into this small ship, as I say, 4,600 of them, and that was the most miserable and ghastly trip when 400 of them jumped overboard. But we picked them up. We were going non-stop from Britain to Sydney, which didn't please anybody. We stopped only to fuel with nobody allowed off in Colombo. But when we were halfway between Colombo and Australia, the atom bomb was dropped. So we were diverted into Western Australia, which was great, particularly for the 2 West Australian officers on board.
Did you get some leave?
Oh, just a few hours, just enough to get home. I was then attached to the British Pacific Fleet, but they had so many officers and their casualties were not as high as expected, as had been the case at Normandy. I then applied to rejoin the RAN, who were very short of officers. And I was put in the HMS Bataan, which was a sister ship of the Warramunga, a tribal class destroyer which had just recently commissioned. I was in her for a couple of years.
So World War II's over, and then here we are 5 years later, and there's another war on in Korea.
Well, in between, we were sent up in the Bataan in the occupation of Japan, and we were on the Korean patrol there where we were stopping the illegal immigration from Korea into Japan under MacArthur's overall command, and we were part of the British fleet, which operated with the American fleet on these sort of tasks. That was very interesting to go and see the rubble of Hiroshima and the rubble of Nagasaki and Tokyo and so on. And it was a very difficult time very difficult indeed, because lots of people were being demobbed. And then you got people who didn't really have any experience whatever joining, and you had to try and train them up and keep the ship going. Very hard time it was.
You were a Korean Navy man. Was the end of World War II enough for you to basically change into Civvy Street, or you were committed to see it through?
Well, a tremendous number, because all the reserve officers were leaving, and quite a lot of the permanent officers wanted to leave and did too. I wanted to stay in the Navy, even though conditions were pretty terrible in some ways. Well, then I was sent from the Bataan to a minesweeper, HMS Swan, which was in charge of the clearing of the barrier reef. We had a considerable force of minesweepers, I think about 8 of them, based in Cairns. There was no naval authority there. We were clearing the minefields there, which was very exciting. Occasionally things went wrong and terrible explosions, and all the crockery would be broken and we'd be thrown about a bit, but we didn't get sunk. Then I was put in as the captain of a small converted general purpose vessel, which was filled with batteries and generators and made into a magnetic minesweeper. And there were 2 of us converted to New Ireland, a place called Vieng, right at the top of New Ireland, where we had to clean up the Japanese and the American magnetic mines. That was an experience and a half, because our top speed was only 6 1/4 knots. We were so low in the water that the engine and portholes all had to be blanked over. We were underwater as much as we were above water in storms, and it took us a long time. We had to get to New Britain. And I was flown out of there in a Catalina to go and do a long gunnery course in Britain.
So World War II is over, and your nation calls on you again, Andrew, to serve now in the Korean conflict.
Yes, well, what happened roughly, I did the long gunnery course, which was 15 months of very intensive training in Britain, and then I was posted back to Australia at the gunnery school down at Flinders Naval Depot, and then the ship commissioned, and we, within about 2 months, we were sent off to the Korean War, which was very exciting with all this new equipment. We were the only ship up there, including all the American ships of our size, could fire all our secondary armors as well as the main armament against aircraft day or night. That was a very interesting time. We had a few skirmishes, and we were on both coasts. I went up there a second time in the Anzac. The second time, Admiral Captain Gattaker, who was a very famous officer in our Navy, who of course had been the navigator of the battleship Rodney when she sank the Bismarck, and he'd been the fleet operations officer in the Battle of Savo Island and things like that. And he was very senior, so we were always in charge of the American and British destroyers and frigates and things on the inshore on both coasts. We ranged right up to the Russian and Chinese borders. At night we took on the trains. They kept them in tunnels in the daylight because all the bridges had been destroyed, because air power from the carriers on each coast and from the huge United States Air Force in South Korea and in Japan, by daylight nothing moved. They couldn't. But at night they would have great construction battalions which rushed out of the villages and put in place Brayley bridges. We knew the trains would start running about 11 o'clock at night. So we'd knock them off to stop their supplies to the huge Chinese army. It was all very frustrating, and we could all see why MacArthur was so frustrated, because he was sitting on great naval power. It was full of officers with great experience of amphibious warfare, and he could have done what he'd done at Incheon before and landed anywhere he wanted to in North Korea and cut off the forces which were confronting our army. The Chinese, of course, had about 1 million men there, and he couldn't use this power, and he couldn't bomb the bases which they were being supported from in North China, and he was very frustrated. You could see why he was frustrated, because these tremendous battles were going on which the army had to face. When all this, he had this enormous power he couldn't use. At the same time, a lot of us felt that when he was fired by Mr. Truman, that was correct, because we would have been in World War III probably.
So with Korea ending, where do you go to from there?
Well, then I was in the carrier Sydney. We went in the Sydney to the coronation, took a squadron of aircraft, and they took part in the great flyover, and we took part in the fleet review at Spithead, where we were in the carrier line with a number of other carriers, the Canadians, and several British carriers. And we were right opposite the Soviet cruiser Sverdlov, which arrived, and with perfect ship handling, anchored exactly where she should have done. And she, of course, was the most modern, with the most modern technology, that the Russians put enormous effort into their navy, because they could see that they could not become a world power without maritime power. And that was an eye-opener. In fact, a great friend of ours who'd been on exchange here in Australia, was the liaison officer for the Russians, and we spent a night with the officers from the Sverdlov, the first time they'd been allowed off. They weren't allowed off the ship lest they be tainted by what went on in the capitalist world.
So can you share the experience of actually being there for Queen Elizabeth's coronation?
There was great excitement in Britain, and Britain was still then very much a go-go nation. The problems which later arose with the huge strikes and so on hadn't really started. It was a very exciting time. We had to provide in the Sydney about 100-odd men to line the route in the Mall, right next to the Guards, which was quite a job to train them up, because they had to stand still from 7:30 in the morning until 5:30 at night with one 5-minute break, and we had to dry them out so that they didn't suffer too much from that problem, and we had to train them up as to how to do that. And they were extremely good on the day, in the rain and the cold, and did their stuff. We were all quartered in the deep air raid shelter on the Bakerloo line, right under one of the great parks, and that was the coronation.
That was the first part of Angus Hordern speaking with Rear Admiral Andrew Robertson, AO DSC. Volume 2 will be out tomorrow, so do check your podcast feed. We don't normally release episodes on a Wednesday, but in this case we have a special two-parter. You can also check out our website, www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com, or like us on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast, and follow us on Twitter at LOTLPod. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on the podcast. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget. Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
Survival was the rule of the day.
My jaw was broken. I could feel my molars in the centre of
We weren't
my
out there to
mouth.
take country. We were out there
At the end of the day, everyone
That was our job.
wearing green is a
All
soldier.
elections failed, we lost communication.
Getting yourself blown up does some interesting things to you.
A place like the Middle East is constantly
There's
changing.
quite
and
enough
the
pressure
work we
when
do
you
there
deploy
is
and
constantly
you
changing.
We killed Dave.
And just to think it was our own minefield. He holed me up with a broken whiskey bottle
I fought it.
and machete.
Battle for Australia.
Welcome to the second part of Angus Hordern's conversation with Andrew Robertson. We released the first volume of this episode yesterday, so be sure you listen to that first and you'll hear about Andrew's experiences in World War II and Korea. Today's episode covers Andrew's experiences in Vietnam, a near-death crash in London, and the career of a senior Navy officer. This is the rest of their talk for Life on the Line. Enjoy.
So, Andrew, after the coronation, where did you head?
Well, the Sydney then was sent up to replace the British carrier on the west coast of Korea again. By this time they were talking at Panmunjom, so the guns weren't actually firing and the bombs weren't being dropped, but we practiced the whole day. And of course the Sydney could put up 30 aircraft if it wanted to. It was a extremely powerful small carrier because the main aircraft were the excellent Sea Fury fighter bomber and the Firefly anti-submarine aircraft, which is also an attack aircraft with bombs and rockets and so on. And that was a very formidable force. And we were the carrier on the west coast, ready to go at any moment for that second one. I was then posted from her, much to my astonishment, to go to London. So I flown back to Australia and with my wife we went then to Britain, and I was then on the staff in Australia House in London for 2 years. A very interesting time, for our relations with the Royal Navy were extremely close, and anything that we wanted they would fall over backwards to give us, and they paid for half the hull costs of the aircraft carriers Sydney and Melbourne, which almost nobody knows about. But they gave us the most tremendous aid in anything we wanted. And from there, I was posted down to the naval headquarters in Melbourne. It was then, before Mr. Menzies ordered the government to move up to Canberra. I was the gunnery officer on the staff, and I was called out to be the flag lieutenant to the Admiral, the Chief of the Navy, because he didn't have a flag lieutenant. And so I went to things like, because it was the gunnery world looked after gas warfare and they looked after nuclear warfare. So I went with him to nuclear explosions at one of them at Maralinga and those sorts of things, and it could not have been a more interesting time.
How did you feel dealing with Menzies?
Mr. Menzies, he'd come to sea with us in the Anzac, and he was a delightful man. He used to come down the wardroom, and he was one of the world's great raconteurs. He could mimic people, and he was full of fun and laughter. And then we'd get on to our favourite things that we all as young officers thought ought to happen with Australia, and why he'd tell us why it could or couldn't and what people were thinking about. He was very forthright and very frank, and he knew that it was Chatham House rules which were thoroughly obeyed.
So when many reflect on the greatness of Menzies and how he led Australia after the war, you'd fully appreciate that position.
Absolutely. I had met, of course, Mr. Curtin during the war because he was a West Australian, and I was in the train with him once going across. And so we played chess. But Mr. Curtin was a man of a very different character and ability to Mr. Menzies. Of course, Mr. Curtin was very powerful in the trade union movement, and he had his, of course, great supporters. But Mr. Menzies really took Australia forward in enormous leaps over the 15 odd years or whatever it was that he was the Prime Minister after the war. and a lot of us had very great respect for him. He was very brave. In the coal miners' strike, when people were crying blue murder, he went down to talk to them, and he used to go without any escort, nobody with him except his driver, and it was a different world.
Speaking of the world, you're leaving the political and the administrative roles and you're moving back into a command of a ship. Can you tell us about Quick Match?
Yes, well, I joined the Quick Match, and she was a converted destroyer. She'd been a very famous war record, and she was made into an anti-submarine escort. They ripped the guns off her, a lot of them, and they put in the big squid gun mounted anti-submarine weapons which fired a big, huge shell right over the top of the ship, about 1,000 metres in front, and an enormous explosion. They were a deadly weapon. And we had the best British sonars, and of course Britain was right at the top in anti-submarine warfare following the Battle of the Atlantic and the huge war against the German submarines. And these escorts were very well equipped, and of course we still had a destroyer speed. Unfortunately, the Navy was having a great difficulty manning ships, so we said we could run on 100 men instead of 220, which was our official crew, and they sent trainees to us, and we were sent off up to the Far East, and in the Far East we operated with the British fleet, and I just had to tell the Admiral I couldn't go at high speed for very long, and otherwise we would do anything, which we did.
So Andrew, could you tell us what happened after you left the Quick Match?
I was posted then to the British staff in Singapore, and the Royal on exchange with the Royal Navy, and they put me in as their naval planner on what was called the British Defence Coordination Committee, which was the three commanders-in-chief, Navy, Army and Air Force, and the president was Lord Selkirk, the Commissioner-General for Southeast Asia. Well, he, of course, ran Malaya, and there was a great insurgency going on there under Ching Peng, the Chinese-Malaysian leader of the insurgency. And Indonesia was in turmoil. The danger of the Chinese coming south, SEATO was in force, was very much Communist China, was very high concern of everybody. And I was in a little team which reported direct to these commanders-in-chief. I was a naval planner, and there was Army and Air Force and a British Foreign Affairs fella, and we wrote all the papers that were required. It must be remembered that Britain then controlled not just Malaysia and Singapore, but Brunei. It was very much under British protection, and Sarawak and North Borneo were all part of it, and Hong Kong. I used to go up there as the naval planner for Hong Kong as well. So, and to the SEATO meetings with the rest of the British staff, even though I was an Aussie, and that all worked extremely well. SEATO was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation, built up to face what was seen as the communist probability of world war under the Cold War with Russia and China. It was very much, there was NATO in the West, there was CENTO, which was in the Middle East, and there was SEATO, Southeast Asia. And in the SEATO organisation, there was Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, New Zealand, Australia, Britain and America. And we held, of course, very large exercises in the whole area, particularly the South China Sea. The Russians were very heavily then in Indonesia, and they were re-equipping the Indonesian armed forces with the latest missile-armed patrol boats that nobody else had, and with the latest aircraft. It was all at the height of the Cold War.
You're then posted to the Melbourne. And then after the Melbourne?
After the Melbourne, I was sent to Navy office, which by this time, of course, was in Canberra. This was 1964. It was about 2 months before the Voyager collision. And I was sent then to be the Director of Manning and Training.
You're then posted to the Arrow. What happens next?
Well, I was the captain of the frigate squadron, as well as the captain of the Arrow. Another very interesting time, because she was equipped with the first of the digital ICARA missile systems. I'd been involved a little bit at the very start of the ICARA system, when in the little team I was in Navy office, had decided this was the way the Navy ought to go. We took the Yarra up to the Far East, where we operated with the British fleet, and then we did trials with nuclear-powered submarines. In the middle of all this too, we were called out to escort the Sydney into Vietnam, and we did a certain amount of work off the Vietnamese coast, not much, and came back. And we also did a big exercise in the Indian Ocean where we went into Colombo, the first Allied warship to be allowed for many years, because they had a communist government under Mr. Bandaranaike and wouldn't allow Western warships in, and we were the first.
And what were some of the experiences during the Vietnam War?
Well, I didn't really have much experience. I wasn't really in the war much. We just escorted the Sydney into Vung Tau and protected her there and up and back. And that was really, we did a bit of other work off the coast, but that was all. We were not really involved fully in the war.
Did you have any shore leave or opportunity to speak to them?
No, we just kept it. We were right on the qui vive because the anchorage was in range and had been attacked from the shore before, and we were very much concerned over frogmen in particular for putting limpet mines on us and down on the Sydney, and so we arranged all the defences in these areas.
I understood the Vietnamese also had these fast patrol boats which you had to account for.
Oh yes, but not very much down in that area. I think they had to get through the American and our own screens further north, and so that wasn't a great concern. But we were ready for anything, because you never know if there's a war. You never know what's around the corner. Did
you speak at the time with any men around Vietnam about their experiences in the field and how they were affected by it?
Yes, a great friend of mine was the captain of the Hobart, and of course she was attacked by American aircraft, which was an absolute disaster because they'd been identified as being friendly, but they turned, as they passed the American heavy cruiser and the Hobart, they suddenly turned in and loosed off their missiles into these ships and killed a few fellas, and that was one of these disasters and so on. Otherwise, yes, we spoke to them about bombardments and things, and of course we had the helicopter people up, who I was much involved with later on. They did a marvellous job in the naval helicopter setup up there, and we had clearance divers and so on. That was about it.
Your career with the Navy spanned well beyond Vietnam, but what was the reception like for servicemen such as yourself coming home?
Terrible. It was disgusting, most upsetting, because we had political leaders leading the mobs into protesting about the Vietnam War. But this morphed into an antagonism against the armed forces. And all of us were doing what should be done, obeying whatever the government was, whether we agreed with their policy or not. We were the armed forces, and that was our job. I know later in the Sydney, when I was the captain of the Sydney, and we came into Sydney Harbour with a lot of fellows we'd brought back from army, we'd brought back from Malaysia, and there were several thousand people on the wharf waiting for us, and I got a signal to say that the tugs, there'd be no tugs, there'd be no mail, there'd be nobody to secure us, there'd be no cranes to lift the gangways on, and we were virtually black banned. And the navigator turned to me and said, you'd think you were entering an enemy port in wartime. Fortunately, we had very good relations with the Tigers who broke the ban, and they turned up and helped us. But it took couple of hours to manhandle these enormous cranes using blocks and tackles and things. And there were these thousands of people with their babies and all the rest of it. And then we were banned for mail, which we eventually broke.
And I think the significance is, what is mail? Like, if you've been at sea and the one thing you're looking forward to is news from home, that came via the mail.
Absolutely.
And how did that affect the ship's company?
Great anger, great concern. But it was terribly sad to see a democracy with political leaders leading people who turned against their own armed forces. And people, if they're in uniform, got spat on. Well, this wasn't the Australia we knew or that we'd fought to defend. It was just simply disgusting, terrible, most upsetting.
Yes, I'm sorry. So you returned to Sydney to a most inglorious reception, and the Navy then decides to take you back abroad.
Well, before that, it was decided that Mr. Whitlam decided that he would be nasty to the French and send a frigate to sit in the middle of the nuclear explosions, thermonuclear explosions at Murara. Well, there wasn't a frigate that could get there without refuelling, and the only place to refuel was French possessions. And the tanker was in the dry dock, so the Sydney was stood by to go. Then, unfortunately, Dr. Cairns, who no doubt had many great strengths, he said everybody who got anywhere near their offspring may be greatly affected with all sorts of mutations and things. And the wives of our sailors said, "What about us and our families?" And that was fair enough. And then Mr. Whitlam said, "Well, anybody who doesn't want to go needn't go." Well, we had a marvellous ship's company, so we lined them all up and said anybody who had a compassionate reason needn't go, or other strong reason to see me, and we sorted that out. And the headline in the Daily Telegraph, I think, was something like, Prime Minister says anybody who doesn't want to go needn't go, Captain says we're all going. And so we stood by to do that for a few weeks, and then the tanker came out or something, and she had to stand by, and then the thing fizzled out rather.
So, Andrew, can you please explain your role in defence at this time?
Well, I was sent to the Department of Defence, and I was the leader of what was called the Joint Policy Staff, and we reported to a brigadier who reported to Admiral Dovers, who reported in turn, of course, to Sir Henry Bland, and then later to Sir Arthur Tang, who was, and then I was there for quite a long time, about 3¼ years. I was the leader of this team that was Navy, Army and Air Force at my level, and a Foreign Affairs high-level diplomat, and a civil member of the Department of Defence. So we produced the white papers on defence, which then went through the upper defence machinery, and that was that. And at the same time, there were quite a lot of things going on because we had the independence of New Guinea was in the offing, and we were still under Australian administration. I was sent up with the team to have a look at New Guinea and what was going on. At that time, of course, the Indonesians were putting people across into the Vonomo area of northern New Guinea. And we went up with this team to see what was going on, visited various islands and so on. That was my time in defence. And eventually I got shoehorned out and sent to the IDC in London, Imperial Defence College. Again, a very interesting time. We had a Northern Irishman as the deputy commander and a Southern Irishman, a general, as the commander. And the Irish were, the IRA was in full strength, blowing up people in various parts of London. And in fact, they were after our boss, who was a Southern Irishman. In the Imperial Defence College, we were allowed to select a part of the world for a tour. They hadn't been to South America for many years, and I put down as my first preference to go to South America, which so we did.
And your next posting means you're the CO down at Albatross.
It was the busiest military airfield in Australia because we did day and night flying. We had 7 squadrons. They taught me how to fly a Mackie very badly, and a very brave fellow sat in the back seat to make sure I didn't crash, which didn't happen, fortunately. And it was a very great experience. We then built the Fleet Air Arm Museum there, saved all the old aircraft that had been saved by previous captains, and we created the Naval Aviation Museum.
I must share that I've had the pleasure of looking through your museum at Albatross, and it is lovely. I mean, and I was based at Creswell, and I can associate the great facilities that we had at Albatross and Creswell so nearby. So, Andrew, it must have been hard to leave Albatross, but what came next?
I was sent up to be the Director General of Operations and Plans in Navy Office, the future of the Navy and its future plans.
And what came after that?
And after that, I was promoted to Acting Rear Admiral, and I was sent off to London, where shortly afterwards I was made a full admiral, and I was the head of the defence staff. In those days, of course, we had 428 officers under my aegis in the Army, Navy and Air Force, and we had them in the British Army of the Rhine, we had them in submarines, we had them in aircraft, and of course the Cold War was very much still in force. And it was a very interesting job indeed. They asked me to organise memoranda of understanding with governments in Europe so that eventually, if we wanted to, we could use the basic agreements to purchase defence equipment or anything else that might be relevant, which I did, and that was interesting, going to see the defence ministers concerned and so on. We had a very intriguing time in Britain, attending the commissioning of other submarines and launching of destroyers, and we took the Minister of Defence up to the first patrol boat, which was being built at Lowestoft, the Fremantle class patrol boat, and we ended up with Lord Fremantle himself, after which, of course, with the same name, a descendant of the original Fremantle, after what Fremantle was named, went up there too. And that particular trip was interesting because we took the Minister for the Navy, of the Royal Navy, and Mr. Killen, who's a marvellous raconteur and great company, and we flew up to Norwich, and then we got from there a car and went down to Lowestoft. It was midwinter, a very silly time to be there. We did our stuff and looked over the patrol boat. That was all fine, and had discussions with the people at Brook Marine in Lowestoft. And then we went back to Norwich to get in the aircraft. It was an aircraft of the Queen's Flight in Andover, and a huge snowstorm had arrived, and the snow was pelting down, and we took off, and after we'd taken off, about 20 minutes later, the captain of the aircraft came down to us and said, "Sirs, we're very sorry to tell you all the electrics have failed. We've lost communications, we've lost radar, we've lost everything, but the engines are going." And we said, "Well, that's nice and reassuring. And we can't communicate with anybody. Nobody will know where we are because of the snowstorm." So we said, "Well, what are you going to do?" So he said, "Ed, of course, it's very busy, the airspace in Britain, with airliners going all over the place and military aircraft and so on. We'll fly between the levels, and we'd held for our base in the very west of England, down the Brize Norton, I think it was." And so Mr. Gillen said, I'm supposed to be giving an address at the Mansion House to a great reception tonight, but it appears I won't be there. And the pilot said, well, now, within the next 15 minutes, an air alert will go out all over Britain that this aircraft is missing with all of us on board. And that's that, because they won't be able to know where we are or talk to us or anything. And so the pilot said, if we get our DR right, our dead reckoning, because we haven't got any other means of navigation or anything else, when we get down there, we'll dive below the cover and hope that it's still high enough off the ground for us to be able to see. And if we can see the control tower at Briars Norton, they'll see us and fire a green various light, then we'll land in the snow, which by this time was, I don't know, 18 inches deep or something. Well, so we went on yarning and we had a bit of a sleep, and we did arrive, and we dived around under the clouds, and they could see enough, and they did see us, and we did land, and everybody but somebody, the air officer commanding the whole of the southwest of Britain was there, and everybody thought we'd crashed somewhere, but we hadn't. And so that was a very interesting little sideline of life. And but we went to all sorts of meetings, met all sorts of people at very high level, and it was a highlight in our life, really.
Certainly landing safely enabled your life, this amazing story, to continue. So for the 5th time, you bid farewell to London and you return home.
Yes, we did. And I was posted then to Sydney here. We, of course, had our house in Canberra and so on, but we were quartered here in that lovely house, Tresco. We had top people from all over the world could stay there with us, and you got to know them. People like the head of the British Defence set up, Indian Navy, Japanese, all sorts of people could stay, and then you could really get to know them in your house. And so it had a sort of diplomatic role as well as being the Navy house, where you could get to have the top members of government and all sorts of people in what is our greatest state, in our biggest city, and our biggest naval base, and one of our biggest ports. And I was in charge, of course, then of the shore stations. And I inspected places like the base in Western Australia, which I was very interested to see again, because in the little team I'd been in defence years before, we'd put up that it was necessary for Australia to start building a decent naval base in Western Australia, and that's where it ought to be. And that had gone through the machinery, and it had all occurred.
So, Andrew, you retired as a Rear Admiral of the Royal Australian Navy, and you have served 3 major conflicts in the 20th century. What is the importance that you see as the Navy for the defence of Australia today?
I think you have to get right back to geography, because geography controls history, and history reflects forward, and it governs how people develop and their attitudes to life and everything else. In our case, that great Russian admiral, Admiral Gorshkov, who really created the modern Russian Navy, and he was a czar, and he produced class after class of Russian warships to challenge the might of the United States. And I'd been at Greenwich when Mr. Khrushchev and Mr. Bulganin visited Britain, and they'd been dined down at the Painted Hall. And Khrushchev had then said that he was going to build the greatest navy in the world to do exactly that, which he set about to do. And so the Australia, according to Admiral Gorshkov, was the centre of the world's oceans. I often spin the globe and have a look. And actually, it's very hard to find any other place which is so surrounded by sea and by oceans as Australia is, with 3 great oceans, the Indian, the Southern Ocean, and the Pacific, and of course the Arafura Sea and so on to our north. And of course our early people in 1909, our great Prime Minister, Mr. Deakin, supported by the leader of the opposition, Mr. Fisher, decided Australia then should get a fleet and look after itself as much as possible. And that was done. Before World War II, just as it was coming up, people began to realise again the tremendous importance of the oceans, and a certain amount was done, but not nearly as much as it perhaps should have been done to get our Navy in a position to really defend the nation. I think we woke up in a big way after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the government and people realised the importance of aircraft carriers then. And then we moved into carriers, and after 35 years we created an extremely efficient carrier task force. Small carrier, yes. Excellent defence with guided missile ships with the latest frigates who were excellent in anti-submarine warfare, the best helicopters we could get anywhere and so on, best minesweepers, and we had the submarines which were the best conventional ones, the Oberons and so on. We built a very good navy. That was emasculated, starting with the failure to replace the Melbourne, and then the failure to replace the guided missile ships when they came to the end of their time. The navy's never really recovered from that, though it is making strides now. And I think when I left the Navy, of course, it was at its top strength, and we could deploy a carrier task force. Small, yes, but very efficient, and very well defended and very well supported. And of course, much of that went. And it'll take some time yet before we get back to that capability.
So, Andrew, reflecting on everything that you've done, perhaps you should also share the legacy that you've left the nation with regard to why we have an Australian National Maritime Museum today.
Well, that is simply that all my life I've been interested in history, and Admiral Collins probably fired me off to start with because he believed that Australia should have a National Maritime Museum. I was in London, the Australian representative on the Imperial War Museum trustees for about 3 years, and I had a lot of other connections and visited maritime museums all over the world. And I felt that we ought to have one. And when I was the Admiral here, I worked hard to look at sites and talk to governments and people and so on. And eventually I wrote the original report, and we eventually got a National Maritime Museum for 1988. It didn't open then because it took a bit longer with various problems that arose. But we have a National Maritime Museum now, and that, I believe, it's the most visited of the local museums in Sydney now, and it will go from strength to strength to be one of the great maritime museums of the world.
Rear Admiral Andrew Robertson, thank you for your time, your sacrifice and your service to our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today, and I think you're doing a great job. It is extremely important that future generations really consider where the future of Australia lies.
That was the second and final part of Angus Hordern speaking with Andrew Robertson. If you enjoyed the two-parter, please leave us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Good ratings in Apple Podcasts really helps other people discover the show, so we can spread further these amazing Australian stories. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on the podcast. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.